Impacts of ocean acidification on phytoplankton and its implications. Hypothesis. Ocean acidification will cause substantial shifts in the relative constitution of the populations of phytoplankton globally, and, to go further, would in turn cause significant changes to the rest of the food chain as a whole, both aquatic and terrestrial. Phytoplankton. What are they? They are also known as microalgae, exist in the upper part of the ocean within reach of sunlight, and there are two main categories, dinoflagellates and diatoms. They are covered in complex shells largely composed of silicates and carbon, and they can come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. Rationale. Phytoplankton was selected to be a focus because of the following reasons. They are innumerably vast in numbers throughout the entire sea, especially in accordance to their microscopically small size, about 1 billion tons, of which also see great proliferation in numbers that can amount to approximately 45 billion tons annually. Aside from other plant-based primary producers, these can be considered to be among the most crucial life forms in all of the Earth's oceans, as they constitute a massive, critical portion of the foundation of numerous marine food webs. More on this later. Assessment. To explore this hypothesis, we can assess the phytoplankton in the following ways. Migration. Observe over an experimental set period of time where the different phytoplankton populations end up as a result of changing acidity in the water around them. Quantity. Account for what happened to the relative sizes of various select groups of phytoplankton populations under OA conditions. Do they shrink? Do they grow? And which ones? Development and growth. Observe what physically happens to various select major groups of phytoplankton as a result of the change in pH. What groups may grow faster or slower than under normal present conditions. Genetic epigenetic assessments. Run a series of various genetic tests to examine just what may be happening to these organisms at the molecular level, what leads the various groups to perish or flourish or under more acidic conditions. Various tests include, first, those that will assess the standard DNA sequences of the various groups to evaluate the amount of genetic diversity that may be at play here and to confirm the distinctions between species. Then, use other tests to assess what potentially epigenetic phenomena may be occurring among these groups. Such tests include common approaches to evaluate DNA methylation via high-performance liquid chromatography, or HPLC, used to quantitatively measure the total amount of methylated cytosine in a DNA sample. Bisulfite sequencing, effectively allowing us to observe, via PCR, the locations at which methylated cytosines are present in the sample, and CpG island microarrays, done to cover what the other methods cannot, as well as allowing for mass genome analysis with only small amounts of sample required, which is very useful for a research study such as this, as there are just so many numbers of phytoplankton in even a drop of water alone. Other epigenetic analysis techniques can include DNA-protein interaction analysis to show how exactly chromatin modifications impact gene expression. And you also use ATAC sequencing to evaluate regions of open chromatin across the genome to see what areas of the DNA are eligible for expression if not so previously. The logical next step. This is the logical next step in further potential research because effects on phytoplankton from ocean acidification will show us a perspective on what a large part of the rest of the food chain or marine ecosystem may look like from the changes of said phytoplankton in the environment. Deviations from the norms on either side of the spectrum, as in deterioration or proliferation, a deficit in numbers will mean that the upper levels of the various corresponding food webs will be more strained for resources, aka food, and excess in numbers will mean that the conditions of the waters that have such blooms will prove uninhabitable due to the large amounts of toxic compounds produced by said blooms, so habitats for other organisms will be affected as well. Animals from all rungs of the food chain rely back onto phytoplankton, ranging from animals as small as zooplankton to creatures as large as the baleen whale, all of which feed directly on phytoplankton. In other words, animals like sharks or other large fish that do not directly feed on primary producers consume organisms that are smaller still, that eventually will have fed on animals that consume phytoplankton. Therefore, as phytoplankton are affected, then very logically so too will much of the rest of the ocean's inhabitants one way or another, aside from the direct OA impacts they experience as is. An example of a domino effect in nature per se. Possible difficulties and solutions. Possible difficulties can include the fact that these organisms are very small, so to track them individually, or even in small groups, can be difficult even in an experimental, situational setting, especially if conducted in nature. Another is that phytoplankton are essentially susceptible to temperature changes, so warmer environments usually are not good for these organisms. So to ensure that the study only assesses effects due to acidity and not temperature, or still other variables, could be difficult. However, a remedy for this is to sample phytoplankton of each respective select species group in reasonably higher numbers so as to have enough to execute the experiment in lab as well as under optimal temperature conditions as best as can be for the general sampling of phytoplankton. This study very much has broad implications. Further still, they are the source of much of the world's oxygen supply. So imagine what the world as a whole would be facing should phytoplankton diminish or change entirely. This study, in essence, would show the impacts of OA not only in the marine world, but on the Earth as a whole, aquatic and terrestrial. This further has heavy implications on the entire world's ecosystem. For instance, generally, a polar bear eats things that start feeding on a diatom, and is probably not fed by something that feeds on Prochlorococcus, for example. The whole food chain is going to be different. So overall, the continually worsening addition of ocean acidification, the statistics will likely fluctuate even more as time passes, which will, based on all that has been discussed in this presentation, cause a radiating wave of changes globally in many different contexts. Such contexts include, physically, the conversion of carbon into oxygen will see changes. The conversion of carbon into the oceans and transfer into the seabed will see changes, likely decline due to the increasingly lesser numbers of phytoplankton or diatoms available to convert carbon in the water into silica that would eventually settle to the ocean floor, which could potentially compound onto the OA phenomenon as carbon is not being as removed from the water itself. As the phytoplankton species populations change in both number and constitutions, and potentially even more physiologically, the rest of the, at the very least, marine food chain will see great shifts as discussed. The aforementioned shifts can cause land animals that rely on seafood to also see change. Moreover, these factors very much will influence the human world, some of which includes our consumption and usage of seafood or aquatic organismal resources. Our foods and accessibility to certain resources will see change, as well as our economy built upon these things, and so on, as one can imagine. Takeaways. Therefore, a study like this will aid in our understanding of just how these changes will look, and just what kinds of good or bad conditions could appear. It can provide a general survey on just what our oceans, and world as a whole, may be subjected to sooner than we think. Climate change is real. Global warming is happening. OA is happening. And much of it has been evidently shown, via numerous studies so far, to have been exacerbated by human action. Doing a study like this can also be done to give people a fair, hopefully eventually more tangible projection on what state our world is in, and what it would become, and how we are all contributing to it. A reality check in that if people do not want to see these drastic changes, they should begin to become aware, care, and actively do what they can to at least possibly mitigate the further adverse effects of OA and global warming.